Good evening, friends. Today and tomorrow, we are on very interesting topics. Some things which could be the game changer for Global South, for India, for Asia, for Africa, for South America. And what is this? Number one is the 15th summit of BRICS. And second is the Chandrayaan 3's landing a rover onto the surface of the moon and on the southern side, where no other nation has till today landed a rover. These two events, in terms of the position of leadership or emerging leadership of India in the Global South, and the establishment of position of India in the space, followed with space industry, satellites, and trip to moon and Mars. So let's start with the first one now. BRICS, as the initials stand for, B-R-I-C, Brazil, Russia, India, China. The first summit was held in China, and you will notice that the acronym is not according to the size of the country, not starting with C or I, then going on to R, and then going on to B. Brazil, as you know, is the largest economy of South America, and its current president, Lula, is a socialist party person and very pro-poor. Then, about a decade ago, this organization invited South Africa, which is one of the larger African economies, more advanced educationally and socially, representing about 2% of the world's population and about 2% of the GDP. Now, these five nations account for 40% of the world's population and 24% of the global GDP. Now, as it has progressed, it has shown that the principles which it is following, that means all the nations are equal, all the people are equal, nobody has got more votes because they have invested more in the organization or in its bank called the National Development Bank. Unlike IMF and World Bank, where the shareholding is dependent on the contribution made. So US, Europe have far more of a shareholding than the others. Now, what is it that the current summit is all about? Current summit is in South Africa. It is a kind of summit which has never been held in Africa before. South Africa is welcoming at least 50 heads of state to its conference halls in Johannesburg. And the teams, called the Sherpa teams, have been working on the agenda for one full year. Business Council meetings have been held in Johannesburg also and in different parts of the world. All the leaders have reached there, except Mr. Putin, who will be participating online, and Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister, is representing him. There are 5 major areas which this summit will be handling. Number one, expansion, because something like 70 countries have expressed their interest in joining the organization. There seem to be some differences in terms of the speed with which it should expand. Brazil and India are not in favor of very fast expansion, while China and Russia are favoring expansion. They probably have their own national reasons to do so. Brazil and India are not under the Western sanctions, So they are not taking the growth of BRICS as an anti-West platform, while Russia and China, which are under a lot of pressure, including the sanctions pressure from the West, are perhaps looking at substituting the financial systems controlled by US and other Western countries. So item number 1 therefore is expansion. How much to do, how fast to do, but the interest is tremendous. 70 countries is not small, and even the 40 nations who are 40 to 50 nations who are attending the summit, that is heads of state, not at a second level, account easily for more than half of the population of the world, and maybe close to again 40 to 50% range of the GDP. So if this solidifies, then we are looking at a very strong bloc corresponding to G7 or NATO, so on. Though the program of collaboration is basically economic at this stage, and some scientific things are there, like space, like vaccines, like education, and then of course the issue of infrastructure is there. Now, Mr. Xi, the President of China, has already reached there, and it will be followed by Mr. Modi, who will be reaching there, and of course Ramaphosa is already there, and Mr. Lula has also reached there. So they will be having one-to-one meetings also on the sidelines of the summit, and China has said that it will be supporting, and Mr. Ramaphosa is asking for support for infra for whole of the Africa. Incidentally, African Union has also been invited, UN has also been invited for this meeting, and they will be represented by their chief executives. Now, second point is about common currency. This is a bit controversial issue. The idea is to break the hegemony of the American dollar. Sometimes they call it de-dollarization. India is not that active on this front because it has a different approach. Yes, US dollar has been the reserve currency. It is also a major currency for transactions, which has been reducing a little bit over a period of time, but still about 50% to 60% transactions are done in the American dollars. But if you just take the examples of Russia, all these four nations, Russia, China, Brazil, and India, last few years they have increased what is called common currency transactions or mutual currency transactions. India also has an agreement now with 18 countries. China has something like 40 countries where mutual currency is acceptable. India recently did an agreement with UAE. Before that, it was with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and others to accept, and of course Russia in terms of rubles, rupee trade, and the corresponding banks are there who open the Vostro accounts. So if I'm buying something from UAE or selling something to UAE, it can be done in rupees or dirhams, and dollar intermediation is not required. So the summit itself will be discussing this issue and coming to some sort of a conclusion. There are some people who have been arguing for a BRICS currency, maybe gold-backed. And if you see the background, that Russia, China, India, Brazil have all been, and South Africa, of course, produces a lot of gold, have been accumulating gold, and people suspect that these countries might go for gold-backed currency. But my own estimate is that that's a little too soon. They would perhaps not do it because capital account convertibility is involved, macroeconomic policies are involved, and they have to be aligned. And it's not like the Europe where the spectrum of GDP or GDP per capita of the people is not that large, while spectrum in terms of few African nations and let's say China and Russia and Brazil will be too vast to configure a common macroeconomic policy. But let's see that this is going to be a topic for a number of years to come. The third point is about peace in Ukraine. There will be some stand taken. Most of these nations have actually been neutral. like India, like Brazil, like China, and they have not supported West on the Ukrainian issue, which creates other problems related to sanctions, etc. Now, then, finally, the food security. Um, Starting with the Ukraine conflict or the supply-demand situation of wheat, that is affected, and that food security issue impinges on Africa the most, poorer countries of Africa, let's say the Sahel region or the Sahara region. And that is where now the other issues are there of Niger going for a coup, and a very strong resentment against France and 13 nations where Francophone Africa is there, and to get rid of the yoke of France and any other colonialists. They all produce a lot of raw materials, and which are taken away by the colonial or ex-colonial powers. While Niger stopped to be a colony of France in 1980, but in a sense still a quasi-colonial situation exists, and so also in the rest of the West African nations, 13 of them, who have a setup called ECOWAS. And India will be playing a positive role in this, in terms of either supplying rice or wheat to these areas which are food short. And Russia has already said to 6 African nations it will be supplying 50,000 tons per head per country, free of cost. India had already supplied to Afghanistan 50,000 tons of wheat as a gift, and Pakistan, of course, came in the way for not allowing the transportation. So now India has gone through the Chabahar port, which is relatively new, and India has few berths which are under its own operating management. So let's say on these 5 issues, we have to watch what happens in the summit. The words which have been said before, like yesterday, Ministry of External Affairs giving itinerary of Mr. Modi, Prime Minister of India, and then going from here to Greece to work out some trade agreements, and from there to Indonesia to work out trade agreements. So India's Prime Minister is, of course, traveling it with a number of multiple objectives. Now, if there is a meeting on the sidelines with Mr. Z, then it will be epochal. Maybe the relationship between India and China will soften, and that will be good for both of the countries. So BRICS would have materialized that. And then we talk about the final issue is the National Development Bank. National Development Bank was set up, headquartered in Shanghai, with Mr. Kamath, the former chairman of the ICICI, as the president there. And after his terms, there was one more president, and currently the president is Ms. Delma, who is the former president of Brazil. It is something like, somewhat like World Bank, but with more social objectives, primarily supporting infrastructure. The 5 countries gave $20 billion each as a starting private equity. That's $100 billion. And they have begun picking up money from the market as bonds. The latest is 2 days before in South Africa itself, $1.2 billion worth of bonds were floated. And before that, 2 years before that, they had talked about a total line of 10 billion rands, which is the currency of South Africa. When Mr. Kamath was there, 100 projects worth $33 billion were financed, and so far none of them is a non-performing asset, and it has been a good investment. So the African countries, particularly the poor countries, would have another source of social or developmental finance compared to World Bank, and they could look at which one is giving better terms, and this will be BRICS' own bank. Therefore, perhaps the members of BRICS would be more enthused about dealing with it also. It is not a third-party bank of big colonial powers. And there is a movement again in G20 summit. Next month, it will be coming up as to how to reform the multipolar or multi-development banks like IMF and World Bank for the funding purposes. So BRICS major issues will be, as the time goes by, its own currency. Until that time, encourage the common currency or mutual currency transactions, which means cut down the cost of dollar intermediation. Its own expansion, develop good ways of food security, develop good ways of financing infra projects. Mr. Z, I think, already today promised to South America whatever is required for putting up the infrastructure projects. India would also be giving some special things for the Africa. It could be medicines, it could be vaccines, it could be science, it could be space labs together, and tying it up with the Chandrayaan success, hopefully so, and then a deal through Indonesia with the ASEAN would put India into the next orbit, so to say, of international relationships, and taking its position closer to the leadership of the global south. There is some discussion in India also that whether China will remain or become stronger in BRICS. My own concern is that perhaps that would not happen, though China might give more aid, financial, and more investment because it has more capital, but it doesn't seem to have an objective of any military type domination or colonial type domination, and is genuinely concerned, along with India, to develop a good framework for the further social development, economic development, educational development of Africa in particular, but poor countries throughout the world. As far as NDB is concerned, United Arab Emirates, UAE, Bangladesh and Egypt, three major countries population-wise, have already become members of the NDB, and Saudi Arabia. So with Saudi Arabia, UAE being there, the issue of funding is also not that difficult. Similarly for China, as long as they get good projects, why should not they invest through this? And NDB has developed very strong. So this network would perhaps be growing, and some people would think that it is anti-West, but it will grow for the benefit of its own member nations on a basis of equality for man, equality for nations. So we will catch up and see what transpires in the next 2 days in terms of the output or outcomes of this particular summit, and going forward, what is likely to happen. For India, of course, this is a grand opportunity of G20 on one hand, BRICS on the other, and the success in the space to tie up things together. The image of India would have improved. Thank you.